Hello everyone and welcome to my newly set up home office. I've moved from the dining room into the guest room so I can have a little more quiet and do my day job. So in my last video I talked to you about sort of trans history in the mid 1800s and a little bit of what was going on in the US at the time. And really just wanted to hammer home the point that trans history is long. There have been trans people for as long as humans have existed. There's ancient history um, recordings of people transitioning genders or living as two genders or three genders or no gender. Um, so while it sometimes can seem like a new phenomenon, it is in fact actually as old as humanity itself. It just hasn't been always named transgender like it is now. So that's just something to note from that first video. I hope you watched that already. So in part two, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact that medicine had on transgender history. So as you probably know from this class, trans people can transition surgically, they can transition hormonally or medically, or they can transition just through clothing and body modification. They can transition through comportment of their body, the way they hold their bodies, their voices. So things that don't involve medicine at all are other options. So any and all of those things can be part of a trans experience. Um, so it's important to know that there's a whole gamut of trans experiences. You don't have to have had surgery in order to be trans. Okay, so that being said, medical practitioners and institutions have long had the power to dictate what's normal, what's healthy, and what's sane, as well as what is abnormal, unhealthy, and insane. And that has some huge implications. That power can transform otherwise neutral human differences into oppressive hierarchies. Um, Despite the popular belief that science is abstract, that it is impartial, that it is unbiased, we know that human beings are not impartial or unbiased. We took our implicit association tests. Scientists hold those implicit associations just like all of us do. Humans don't exist in a vacuum. So scientists also exist in the same world as the rest of us, where they're absorbing messages about gender and sexuality and race and class and everything. So those biases can exist in science just like they do in any other part of life. So doctors and scientists throughout history have brought some of their own biases to understanding of normal versus abnormal behavior. And the normal versus abnormal medical diagnosis has been both empowering to trans folks as well as deeply damaging, depending on how that sword was wielded. Um, so throughout a lot of history, trans people have had to rely heavily on the medical community to construct um, trans phenomenon as mental illness or as a physical malady, because being diagnosed with an illness allowed you to seek attention and treatment for the illness. So if trans experience is normal and there's no medical diagnosis, you might not be able to access surgery, for example. But if it's considered abnormal and you need to have surgery in order to become normal, then you again need that diagnosis from a medical practitioner in order to access surgical or medical alterations. So sickness is the condition in and of itself that legitimizes any medical intervention. So sickness equals access to healthcare. But sickness also equals stigma. So having trans experience identified as a sickness makes it seem like something that both needs to be cured and also potentially needs to be stigmatized and kept away from normal society, right? So I'm going to go to sort of early trans history, back to the 1800s. In 1864 in Austria, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs published his first booklet on earnings, or female souls enclosed in male bodies, and that's spelled Urnings. Along with Ulrichs, Karl Maria Kurtbeny, coined the term homosexual in 1869 to describe same-sex love as an element of gender inversion in earning, or excuse me, without the gendered element. So before Courtney came in and talked about homosexuality as being same-sex desire or same-sex love, that was getting tied up a lot in transgender identity because any sort of behavior that was seen as violating your gender role was seen as um, deviation. So homosexuality allowed us to start, the term homosexuality allowed us to start separating the desire to dress or live as a man or woman, different than the gender you were born in, versus the desire to have sexual relationships or romantic relationships with someone of the same sex. Those are two different ideas. Prior to 1864, those two things had been largely assumed to be the same. So it was very meaningful when Ulrichs and Kirpney worked together to coin these terms to help us understand some of the differences between the two. I hope that makes sense. That will be described a little bit further in the PowerPoint as well for you. The two of them were also the first to argue that homosexuality and earning had a biological basis, and therefore people who experience either are normal members of society and deserve to be treated fairly and normally just like anyone else. And that was a pretty radical viewpoint at the time, to say this is just a biological deviation, it's normal, and there's lots of biological deviations. But as you can imagine, that logic has sort of two edges to it. On the one side, it's still used a lot in activism today, where particularly during the crusades for marriage equality, folks would talk a lot about how LGBT couples, or mostly L and G and B couples, were the same as straight couples, and they just want the same love or the same access to marriage and the same access to rights and privileges. We're the same, we want the same rights. But the other side of that was that, saying that there's a biological basis would also imply that, or allows one to argue that gay and trans folks are degenerates and that their biological/medical condition needs to be corrected, right? More like any other biological illness that requires medical intervention to cure. So that same logic was used both for affirming trans identity and also denying trans identity. So that's one we've always, in LGBTQAI history, have struggled with, because the sameness rhetoric, the biological basis for this experience, that rhetoric is very easily palatable by liberal audiences, but doesn't lead very well to radical liberation, or to the idea that people who don't feel like they're the same as everyone else, there's no room for those people, right? So you can see how that could go both ways, to both help and hurt. In 1910, Magnus Hirschfeld coined the term transvestite. And as you know from last week, that term means dressing like another sex than the one you were born in. And his book, The Transvestites, talked about how to medically treat transvestitism. So it talked about using psychology to treat this illness, in essence, that largely they were speaking about men who wanted to dress as women, that this is a psychological illness and here's how you can treat it. In 1913, psychologist Havelock Ellis wrote about the sexo-aesthetic inversion, or wanting to look like another sex. So this is another early mention in 1910 and 1913. These are some early mentions of people who wanted to dress in what we now would probably call drag. Hirschfeld also wrote about sexual intermediaries, or the idea that every human represents a unique combination of sex characteristics, secondary sex-linked traits, erotic preferences, psychological inclinations, and culturally acquired habits and practices. Much of his work, unfortunately, was destroyed by Nazis during their reign in Germany. They brought an end to a lot of his research by burning down his research institute and burning many of his texts. So he was a radical for his time, and sadly, a lot of his original research was damaged during the Nazi reign. In the presentation, you'll see an image of Nazis burning books. That wasn't necessarily his clinic. We don't have pictures that clearly depict his clinic. It may or may not be, no one really knows, but it's an image of books being burned, so you can get a sense of kind of what was going on at the time in Germany where his work was being done. Another big change at the time was in 1931, Dora Richter was the actual first documented patient to undergo male to female genital transformation surgery. And you can see an image of her as well as in the slide. So that was a pretty big deal. It wasn't publicized as largely as Christine Jurgensen, who we'll hear about a little bit later, and her experience was highly publicized. Okay, I'm going to leave off at that for now, but I'm going to post another video shortly about mid-century progress and challenges. So we'll start talking about the 40s and 50s when an awful lot was going on, both positively and negatively for trans folks. So keep an eye out for that one. Bye.